You know the drill. A fast-paced plot, a dramatic twist, and a voice begging for your engagement. Forget it. I'm just fixing a clock that leaks honey. I don't have a story to tell, just a series of mechanical errors. If you're looking for a reason to stay awake, you won't find it here. Just let the ticking carry you off. The heat inside the grandfather clock was unexpected. A humid warmth that smelled specifically of ancient brass and recently spilled caramel. The honey that should have been seconds was not merely leaking, it was oozing, a thick golden cascade that coated my wrists up to the cuff. It had the density of regret, slow and pulling everything down. My tweezers, carved carefully from the delicate, hollow beak of a hummingbird, kept sticking fast to the escapement wheel. Every time I pulled them free, a fine, almost invisible strand of caramelized time stretched between the gears. I sighed, and the sound was immediately absorbed by the heavy silence of the tower. My hammer, the one made of compressed air, needed reloading. It wasn't a matter of refilling the air, but of waiting for the internal mechanism to stop sighing. A process that usually took until Thursday, regardless of what day it actually was. I was quite sure the sun had indeed retired, moving somewhere warm like Florida, leaving the sky here permanently tinted that specific weary shade of mauve you only get when the tea, frozen solid against glass, begins to thaw just around the edges. The monocled crow, perched precariously on a stack of increasingly smaller leaden weights used for maritime clocks, cleared its throat. A dry, grating noise like sand being poured onto sandpaper. "The texture, Clockmaker," the crow announced, adjusting the tiny lens over its left eye with a preternaturally clever foot. "The absolute, fundamental texture of Tuesday is paramount. It must not be grainy. Grainy Tuesdays are a disaster. They should be velvet. Smooth, slightly cold velvet." I didn't look up. My vision had narrowed to the miniature universe inside the clock's casing, where the brass gears were struggling through the golden muck. The honey, now thickening further, was indeed starting to sound like someone whispering my grandmother's maiden name. A long, complicated string of silent consonants and an unnecessary hyphen. It was tedious and intensely personal, a sound designed only for my specific brand of fatigue. My fingers ached. Not from strain, but from the simple, grinding fact of having to exist in this state of perpetual stickiness. I had been attempting to wind the mainspring for what felt like 3 consecutive geological eras, using a key made of cold, polished whalebone. Each rotation was met with resistance, not mechanical resistance, but a sort of profound philosophical objection from the clock itself. I stopped. I didn't choose to stop, exactly. The decision simply arrived, uninvited, like dust settling on a forgotten portrait. My hand froze mid-rotation on the whalebone key. The grandfather clock, deprived of my effort, did not rewind into the past as it was meant to. It just sighed, a slow, viscous exhalation of thick honey that dripped onto the worn wooden floorboards, with a sound like a single distant raindrop hitting a damp wool blanket. "It has ceased moving, Clockmaker," the crow observed, entirely without alarm. "Is this part of the velvety texture we discussed? Does Tuesday stop when the spring is not wound?" "No," I mumbled, flexing my sticky fingers. The honey had begun to crystallize slightly at the base of my nails, making tiny, sharp movements impossible. "It means I am done." I nudged the hummingbird beak tweezers onto the workbench. They landed with a weight that betrayed their actual lightness, sounding instead like 2 very small bronze coins hitting marble. I had spent too long here, breathing air that smelled of pressurized grief and stale copper. My skin felt taut, stretched over bones that seemed suddenly too long for the surrounding atmosphere. I needed to secure the things I required for the journey. We were leaving the tower. Not because the clock was fixed, but precisely because it wasn't. The journey itself was the only cure for a broken timepiece. Movement confuses the gears, sometimes resetting them entirely by accident. I pushed myself away from the bench. My legs protested the sudden change in vector with a heavy, grinding ache, the sensation identical to forcing a rusted bolt to turn. I reached for my travel bag. It was not leather or canvas, but meticulously woven from thousands of retired clock springs, all slightly hardened and coiled tight. It jingled constantly, a low, incessant background hum of wasted potential. I began my inventory. Efficiency was meaningless. Thoroughness was everything. First, the heavy stuff. I lifted the clock itself. It was 6 feet tall and absurdly heavy, now sloshing faintly with honey and broken time. I strapped it horizontally to my back, securing it with thick hemp ropes that smelled of pine sap and the sea. The weight settled immediately, pressing down on my spine like a firm, unyielding statement about the inevitability of responsibility. Next, the small tools. The compressed air hammer was useless now, so I tucked it into a side pocket, careful not to let it sigh too loudly. I located the map. It was indeed drawn on a damp handkerchief, the ink bleeding slightly at the corners, making the demarcation lines between here, definitely not here, and the place shaped exactly like a shoe, indistinct. The moisture meant it stayed cool against my thigh, a tiny geographic poultice. I checked the brass bootlace. Only one, as the other boot simply tied itself out of habit. It wasn't for lacing. It was a calibrated instrument for measuring the depth of shadows cast by artificial light. I dropped it into the bag, where it immediately began jangling a counter rhythm to the springs. Then came the essentials. The jar of captured static electricity, useful for repelling small, overly enthusiastic woodland creatures. A packet of dried mushroom dust that tasted exactly like silence. And the tin box containing exactly 397 dried peas, each meticulously labeled with the name of a forgotten European duke. I wasn't sure why I carried the dukes, but leaving them felt irresponsible. I looked at the crow. It hadn't moved. It was still staring at the honey, presumably deciding if sticky gold goo constituted the correct velvety texture of Tuesday. "We are departing, customer," I informed it, my voice raspy from disuse. The crow tilted its head, causing the monocle to catch the mauve light from the tea window. Departing? But who will confirm the quality of the non-grainy texture of my temporal ice cream? "I imagine the journey will confirm it," I said, shrugging. The motion caused the grandfather clock strapped to my back to groan internally, a muffled, woody complaint. The world moves sideways when you travel. Flavors shift. Tuesday may become a color by the time we reach the foothills. I walked toward the doorway. The exit was not a door, but a circular aperture, traditionally sealed with a stopper made of compressed fog. I pushed it open. The fog stopper sighed, dissolving immediately into the thin air, carrying away the scent of metallic heat and replacing it with the sharp, cool smell of altitude and distant pine. The cold hit my face. It was the specific, biting cold of high-altitude desert night, dry and sharp, like being slapped with a clean towel. The tower stood on a promontory of igneous rock, sheer cliffs dropping into a valley where the moon had apparently decided to hold a private, extremely bright meeting with all the local moisture. I stepped outside. The rock under my boots was gritty and cold, contrasting sharply with the tacky warmth of the honey still clinging to my hands. I stood there, adjusting the ropes holding the clock, feeling the immense weight of the broken minutes bearing down on me. I realized I was carrying more broken time than usable future. I took one last look back at the tower interior. The amber light from the frozen tea windows seemed suddenly fragile, a temporary shelter I was no longer permitted to occupy. The monocled crow remained exactly where it was, surrounded by its weights and complaining softly about the insufficient smoothness of the chronological ice cream flavor. I didn't wait for a farewell. Farewells are usually heavy and require emotional maintenance. The path down the promontory was not a path at all, but a series of worn, irregular steps carved millennia ago by wind and water, slicked now by a thin film of nocturnal dew. Every step required intense focus. A slip meant plunging the broken clock, the dukes, the brass bootlace, and myself into the cavernous darkness below. I started down, slow and deliberate. The spring bag jingled relentlessly. Jing, clatter, thunk. Jing, clatter, thunk. The air tasted like clean copper and faint ozone, promising rain but never delivering. The silence was absolute, save for my boots scraping against the ancient stone and the perpetual sound of the traveling gear. I felt less tired, not because I had rested, but because the exhaustion had achieved a new, permanent plateau. It was no longer an emotion or a state, but a physical component, like my liver or my left kneecap. I simply was tired. The first 50 steps were dedicated entirely to managing the bulk of the clock. It was awkward, its pendulum catching my every awkward shift. I had to walk slightly bent forward, leaning into the weight, a posture that made my neck muscles burn with a dull, insistent fire. The honey inside the clock was shifting, settling, producing a new, low internal whine. The sound of gears grinding against thick sweetness. I stopped at a jagged outcrop of dark basalt. I slid the clock off my shoulders and set it carefully upright against the rock face. I needed to empty the honey. It was only delaying the inevitable mechanical failure, and it was attracting insects I did not want to deal with. Large black beetles who were obsessed with reversing gravitational pull. I opened the clock door. The smell intensified. Sickly sweet. Overwhelming. I tipped the clock onto its side. The honey poured out slowly, thick and viscous, splashing onto the cold basalt with a sound like someone tearing heavy canvas underwater. It flowed down the rock face, catching the moonlight and glittering for a brief, mesmerizing moment before being swallowed by the thirsty darkness. I watched it go. This was time, dripping away, abandoned. Thousands of sticky seconds, wasted. Once empty, the clock was significantly lighter, though still substantial. The internal components, now freed from the honey bath, began to click and whir uselessly, struggling to find traction in the sudden dryness. The sound was high-pitched and frantic. I gave it a sharp tap on the side. Silence returned, laced only with the distant, dry wind whistling through the valley. I readjusted the load, tying the clock back to my body. The new lightness was almost unnerving, replaced by a sort of hollow resonance. It was like carrying an empty, large animal carcass. I continued the descent. The cold intensified, settling into my joints. I pulled my collar up, noticing the smell of my own coat. Wood smoke, clock oil and that persistent, faint smell of frozen pastry from the tower. I began to contemplate the valley floor. It was vast and indistinct, a bruised purple under the demanding moon. The map, drawn on the damp handkerchief, suggested that the valley contained the Singing Quarry, a place where the granite stones were rumored to hum a single, endless note in the key of E minor. I needed to get there, mostly to find a specific type of abrasive stone used to polish glass that had been scratched by tiny lies. My feet moved mechanically, one foot replacing the other, focused entirely on the tactile reality of the stone beneath my worn leather soles. I did not look at the stars. They seemed too energetic, too insistent upon their own existence. I preferred the ground, which was reliably cold and indifferent. I was concentrating so fiercely on the small movements, the pivot of my ankle, the grip of my toes, that I almost missed the small wooden object tucked into a crevice beside the path. It was a small music box, clearly abandoned. It was made of dark oak, intricately carved with images of sheep wearing spectacles, looking thoroughly bored. Out of curiosity, a rare sensation I treated carefully, I set down the grandfather clock and knelt. The cold seeped immediately into my knees. I picked up the box. It was heavy and surprisingly clean of dust. I turned the small, tarnished silver key on the side. A brief, tinny melody started. A complicated waltz, played just slightly too fast, making the sheep seem even more anxious about their literary appointments. But the music box wasn't playing notes. It was playing temperatures. The air round the box immediately heated up, specifically to the temperature of lukewarm bathwater mixed with cheap wine. It was a localized, small cylinder of manufactured warmth, entirely out of place in the alpine chill. The sheep on the lid seemed to sweat slightly. I held my hands over it, welcoming the temporary heat, a respite from the dry cold that had been chafing the back of my neck. This was a clockmaker's artifact, clearly. Someone had modified the mechanism to transfer kinetic energy not into sound, but into localized thermal pockets. Highly inefficient, but momentarily comforting. I closed the lid. The warmth dissipated instantly, replaced by the familiar sharp bite of the high-altitude air. I debated taking it. It was extra weight, and the tune was irritatingly jaunty, entirely inappropriate for my current level of exhaustion. But the promise of warmth was persuasive. I slipped the music box into the spring-woven bag. It joined the dukes and the brass bootlace, adding a new, faint tick-tick-tick to the general cacophony of my luggage. It was the sound of synthetic, borrowed comfort. I settled the heavy clock back onto my spine and resumed the painful, deliberate descent. My mind drifted, now focused entirely on the granular quality of the air. It felt gritty, full of suspended mineral dust and the pulverized memory of long-dead glaciers. I tried to calculate how many times I had completed this identical, monotonous movement. The shifting of the weight, the scraping of the sole, the inward bracing against the inevitable fatigue. Thousands, perhaps, yet each time felt uniquely tiring, as if my muscles were encountering the concept of gravity for the first time. Every time. As the path flattened slightly toward the mouth of the canyon, the cold began to lose its sharp edge, becoming wetter, heavier. The air now smelled of wet stone and moss, and a faint, savory scent, perhaps roasting potatoes, though I knew logically there were no habitable dwellings nearby. The valley was opening up, promising a new, equally exhausting landscape. I looked down at the handkerchief map. The bleeding ink confirmed I was near the point marked the Great Sleep. a wide, flat expanse of land known for inducing immediate, inconvenient naps. I needed to avoid that. The broken clock on my back, if laid flat, might start ticking backward uncontrollably. I pushed forward, focusing on the texture of my own fatigue. It felt like slightly used cotton, soft but rough around the edges, entirely pervasive. The exhaustion was now the primary feature of the scenery. Everything else, the mountains, the moon, the whispering music box, was merely background noise to the absolute, demanding silence of my own need to stop moving. But stopping was not an option. Not yet. I still had to figure out if Tuesday truly was a velvety flavor, and the crow was still waiting for the answer. The world depended on tedious, absurd confirmations, and I was the one carrying the burden of unfinished time. I decided that the ticking backward wasn't nearly as tiring as the constant stickiness. My thumb and index finger were glued together with the golden honey that leaked from the broken grandfather clock. It didn't taste like much, just thick sugar and the faint metallic tang of very old time. I gently set down the hammer made of compressed air. It made a soft, disappointing sigh as it settled on the workbench and looked at the remaining gears. The crow was still perched on a window pane made of solidified black tea, polishing his tiny monocle with a bit of dried lavender. He wanted Tuesday, the flavor fixed by dawn. I realized I didn't care if the sun rose in the west or if Tuesday ever tasted right. It was too much effort for a day that likely wasn't even scheduled yet. I scraped my hand along the surface of the counter, leaving trails of syrupy residue, and simply walked away from the clock. The little chime it gave off as I abandoned it sounded less like a failure and more like a gentle suggestion that I might need a nap soon. Stepping out of the tower was a sudden sensory shift. Inside, it had been thick, close air, smelling of brass polish, frozen citrus, and that specific heavy scent of time moving in reverse, like dust perpetually settling upwards. Outside, the air hit me like a cold, wet blanket woven from moss and old rain. It was a purple-gray hour. The sky hadn't bothered to pick a direction for the sun yet, so everything was illuminated by a neutral, exhausted light. I still smelled strongly of honey, which worried me. Sweetness attracts things you don't want to meet when you're traveling. My ride was waiting just where I had left it 3 weeks ago. It was a root vegetable, specifically a turnip of truly excessive proportions. It was about the size of a small shed, bulbous and faintly violet white near the top, fading to a bruised, muddy brown at the base. Its skin was fibrous and tough, like old burlap stretched over concrete. It didn't have conventional feet. Instead, it used 4 thick, gnarled roots made of damp cedar wood that extruded and retracted with slow, painful, grinding noises as it prepared to move. It also had a single, massive leaf protruding from its crown, about 10 feet long, which it used as a rudder. The leaf smelled overwhelmingly of damp earth, and the kind of existential regret only a vegetable that had forgotten how to photosynthesize could possess. The saddle I had fashioned was a practical disaster. I had used 3 slices of very dry, slightly stale whole wheat toast strapped together with twine made of human hair. It was brittle, scratchy, and offered absolutely no ergonomic support. Every time the turnip shifted its weight, which happened with the tectonic slowness of continental drift, the toast would crackle warningly beneath me. Climbing onto the great turnip was a feat of minor acrobatics and deep, profound resignation. I used a small folding ladder made of compressed fish scales. The surface of the turnip felt cool and strangely greasy under my boots. "Forward," I murmured to the vegetable. I didn't think it had ears, but it certainly had inertia. The initial movement was like trying to push a mountain with a spoon. There was a low, structural groan, a scattering of gravel, and then the cedar roots began their slow, deliberate pull. Each movement seemed to cost the turnip several days of its natural lifespan. The rhythm was a deep, resonating thump, pause, grind, shuffle, thump, pause. It vibrated up through the brittle toast saddle and into my bones, a monotone, mechanical hum that was already making my eyelids heavy. We were moving across a landscape that seemed determined to remain flat and unremarkable. The ground was packed silt and fine gray pebbles. There were no trees, only short, stout bushes that looked suspiciously like compressed sponges that had been spray-painted green and forgotten. Everything was quiet, except for the internal drama of the turnip. The air was getting colder, clinging to the honey residue on my hands and stiffening it into a hard, uncomfortable glaze. I tried to wipe my hands on the turnip's tough skin, but that just added the wet, earthy smell to the stickiness. Now I smelled like a failed dessert served in a garden shed. I leaned back against the massive leaf, using it as a headrest. It felt fibrous and slightly slimy, tasting faintly of minerals when I accidentally nudged my cheek against it. I pulled my heavy wool cloak tighter. It was the color of dried pomegranate skin, and smelled faintly of old librarians and static electricity. The turnip, which I had named the Tuesday problem, since I hadn't solved the crow's ice cream issue, maintained its agonizing pace. We were maybe 20 feet from the tower now. At this rate, we would reach the actual horizon sometime next week, possibly Tuesday. I realized I was still obsessed with Tuesday. It was an irritatingly symmetrical word. My mind began to drift. I wasn't thinking about clocks or monocles or flavor definitions. I was focused entirely on the small, insignificant physical discomforts. The chafing of the twine around the dry toast. The way the slow thump of the cedar roots seemed timed perfectly to an anxious flutter in my left ear. The perpetual drizzle of cold air down the back of my neck. We passed the first landmark, a low mound of polished river rocks that someone had carefully stacked into the shape of a disgruntled badger. The badger stack was covered in a thin, shimmering film of dew that smelled exactly like industrial floor wax. I considered whether I had remembered to lock the tower door. It didn't matter. Nothing in the tower was worth stealing, unless someone desperately needed a backward ticking mechanism or several gallons of spoiled honey. But the consideration itself took up a good 3 minutes of mental chewing. We traveled for what felt like several hours. The light didn't change. It stayed that relentless, neutral purple-gray. The turnip kept its slow, unwavering trajectory, seemingly guided by some profound vegetable imperative toward a field of better fertilizer. I noticed something disturbing about the landscape ahead. It wasn't flat anymore. It was increasingly dominated by low, rolling hills that were not made of earth, but of tightly packed, brightly colored cotton batting. They looked soft, treacherous, and deeply unappetizing. The air coming from that direction didn't smell like earth or wax. It smelled like warm detergent, and the faint scent of something that had been thoroughly, perhaps obsessively, cleaned. This change in terrain meant the turnip would have to adjust its gait. I braced myself. Navigating soft topography on a hard, rolling vegetable was going to introduce a new level of fatigue. I closed my eyes and focused on the sound of the cedar roots dragging against the damp silt one last time before we reached the fluff. Thump, grind, shuffle. I opened my eyes again. We had covered perhaps another 15 feet. The honey on my hands was starting to flake off in golden, brittle chips. I watched one chip fall onto the turnip's surface, where it dissolved instantly into the vegetable's slightly slick skin. I remembered my grandmother once told me that if you couldn't tell the difference between a forward moment and a backward moment, you should simply wait for the nearest flavor of Tuesday to arrive. I still hadn't figured out if she meant the day or the ice cream, and now, perched on this ridiculous traveling route, moving toward hills of cotton and the scent of laundry, I was too tired to ask. I just needed the travel to be over. But I knew, with the certainty of a clock that refuses to keep time, that the journey was just beginning the long, dull process of dragging itself out. The turnip paused its shuffle. I could hear the roots clicking inward slightly. This signaled a change in surface. We had arrived at the border of the cotton hills. The transition was sharp and tactile, from the crunchy silt to a deep, muffling softness. The first step the great turnip took into the cotton batting was silent. The dense fluff absorbed the sound of the cedar roots completely. All I heard was the sharp, unsettling crack of the dry toast saddle beneath me, complaining bitterly about the lack of resistance. The turnip sank slightly into the white, blue, and pink fluff. The vibration changed entirely. Instead of the rhythmic, structural thump, I now felt a slow, rocking instability, like being aboard a very wide ship stuck in very thick molasses. The air pressure felt heavier here, almost comforting, as if the entire atmosphere was trying to put me to sleep using expensive pillow stuffing. I reached out and touched the hill. The cotton was slightly warm and incredibly springy, like touching a giant's freshly laundered sock. It smelled so much of clean linen that it almost hurt my nose. A sharp, artificial scent that cut through the damp earthiness of my mount. The turnip was struggling now, its cedar roots working harder, pushing through the dense resistance. It moved forward, maybe 1 foot every 5 minutes. The effort was audible only in the low, stressed squeaking of the turnip's own tough skin flexing around the root bases. I was getting colder again. The laundry smell was sterile, offering no warmth. I pulled my pomegranate cloak even tighter. The monotony of the movement was already setting in. The slow, nauseating sway. The visual saturation of the bright, soft hills stretching out endlessly. This was going to take longer than I had budgeted for boredom. I looked back briefly. The tower, with its frozen T-windows, was already a tiny, indistinct pencil mark on the purple horizon. It had receded faster than I expected, likely because the turnip's slow movement was an illusion. Maybe the earth was simply speeding away from it. I settled my head back against the fibrous leaf. The journey had begun with a terrible, sweet stickiness, and now it was progressing into a state of sterile, rocking softness. The contrast was too much work for my brain to process coherently. I closed my eyes. I didn't sleep, exactly. I just let the clean, warm smell of the cotton batting wash over me, trying to ignore the constant, subtle grinding of the brittle toast beneath my weight. We moved deeper into the cotton landscape, and I felt the sticky flakes of honey finally lose their grip entirely, dissolving into the synthetic fiber beneath the great turnip. That was one minor victory, I supposed. The landscape offered nothing else, just slow movement and the insistent scent of fresh cleaning. The grandfather clock finally stopped leaking honey when I aggressively yanked out the spring made of braided iron filings. It didn't start ticking backwards, but it did emit a wet, defeated sigh, and then began to emit a steady stream of lukewarm chamomile tea. A definite improvement. My fingers, cemented together by the gold honey, had achieved a kind of rigid independence, moving as one sticky, useless unit. I left the tweezers, carved from a hummingbird's beak, embedded in the main sprocket. They looked comfortable there, finally at rest. The crow, whose name I was now fairly certain was Bartholomew, tapped his tiny monocle against the frozen tea window, making a sound like a single, perfect snowflake shattering on slate. He was waiting for his dessert, which he insisted must be Tuesday flavored. I was too tired to explain the temporal logistics again. I just nodded slowly and started peeling my skin away from the workbench. The sound was not pleasant. It was the noise of removing ancient wallpaper from damp plaster, slow and frictional. I needed elevation. The tower workshop was claustrophobic, saturated with the smell of old brass and caramelized despair. I shuffled toward the roof hatch, feeling the shift from the honey-damp floor to the stairs, which were inexplicably covered in a fine layer of unsalted, pulverized pretzel dust. Every step produced a dry, abrasive crunch, a sound that irritated the auditory nerves without providing the satisfaction of destruction. When I finally pushed the heavy oak hatch open, it grated on its hinges, letting out a screech that momentarily sounded exactly like the word disappointment. I stepped out onto the tower roof. The air up here was thin, but not empty. It was thick with the particulate matter of failed intentions. It tasted faintly of ozone and warm pennies. The first thing you notice when you get high enough in this world is that the sky is not a vacuum. It is a presence. It hangs low, impossibly close, like the ceiling of a heavily insulated warehouse. It had the color and texture of heavily worn corduroy, a dull, abrasive gray-purple, occasionally punctuated by seams of shimmering, static-charged copper wire. It felt heavy, pressing down not just on the roof, but specifically on the inside of my eyeballs. Gravity here was a polite suggestion, not a law. It seemed to favor objects that were tired of moving. The small gravel ballast stones cemented into the roof tar frequently defied this preference. I watched 3 pea-sized pieces of slate rise maybe 2 inches into the air, hover with visible effort, and then sink back down with a dull plop, settling deeper than they were before. It was the sound of materials trying to negotiate their workload. The light source was the biggest ongoing offense. Since the sun had apparently filed for retirement last Tuesday, or maybe that was the ice cream flavor, I forget, the light was provided by 3 massive, dull metallic orbs, floating perhaps a mile or 2 above the horizon line in the west. They weren't luminous, they were reflective, catching some unknown light source from beyond the curved sky ceiling and throwing it back with grudging efficiency. They rotated slowly, clicking softly like enormous indifferent gears struggling in sand. They generated a lukewarm, irritating glow that didn't illuminate things so much as it simply refused to let them remain completely dark. I leaned against the parapet wall, which was cool and slick with condensation that smelled sharply of nutmeg. I focused on the clouds. They were not vapor. They were solid, vast slabs of compressed, crystallized salt, moving with infinite lethargy. They scraped against the highest mountain peaks in the distance, producing a low, monotonous shoosh sound, the sound of the world slowly filing away its own sharp edges. One cloud, unusually low, drifted directly over the tower. It was mottled green and smelled powerfully of wet cement and expired warranty papers. As it passed, it shed tiny, heavy droplets. This wasn't rain. It was a slow, sticky precipitate. When it hit the roof, it wasn't a splash, but a quiet, dense thunk. I held out my hand. A droplet landed heavily on my sticky fingers. It wasn't water or honey. It was a small, perfectly spherical ball of clear, solidified earwax. It carried a strange, persistent warmth. I watched it pool slightly on my palm before rolling off toward the roof edge, picking up pretzel dust as it went. The laws of aerodynamics were currently being held in contempt. I saw a pigeon attempt to fly past. It didn't flap its wings. It simply engaged its forward momentum. Instead of moving smoothly through the air, it carved a visible, gelatinous path. The air resisted it with the consistency of refrigerated gravy, leaving a brief, shimmering wake that folded in on itself and dissipated with the smell of wet dog fur. The pigeon looked tired, every millimeter of flight requiring enormous, visible effort. I knew, with the kind of dull certainty that only comes from deep exhaustion, that if I yelled, the sound wouldn't travel horizontally. It would rise a few feet, hit the heavy corduroy sky ceiling, and then descend straight down, landing exactly where I was standing, perhaps slightly compressed and tasting of disappointment and nutmeg. I decided not to risk being yelled at by my own voice. I felt a slight vibration beneath my worn leather boots. Not the tower shifting, but something moving within the roof structure. I looked down and saw a faint, perfectly straight crack forming in the tar near my foot. From this crack, a tiny, segmented metallic insect, the size of a cufflink, was slowly emerging. It had too many legs and moved with the frantic, unnecessary complexity of a complicated financial instrument. It crawled determinedly towards a patch of the solidified earwax rain. When it reached the droplet, it didn't consume it. Instead, it carefully unwound a single, extremely thin wire from its abdomen and used it to measure the radius of the spherical wax. The wire glowed with a pale, cold blue light. After exactly 45 seconds of measurement, the insect retracted the wire, issued a tiny, audible electronic sigh, and then burrowed back into the tar crack, sealing the rupture perfectly behind it. The world was clearly busy taking inventory of its own absurdity, and I was just standing in the way, sticky and tired. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the fine cloud dust grating slightly on the surface of my skin. My mission had been to observe the world outside, and the world outside was just a poorly constructed diorama held together by sheer willpower and bad physics. It was exhausting just to witness the persistent effort required to maintain this level of concrete nonsense. I decided I should probably go back downstairs before Bartholomew the Crow tried to pay me with a promissory note written on the inside of a peeled orange. I needed to find a bucket of solvent that smelled specifically like forgotten childhood birthdays to get this honey off my hands, and I knew exactly where to look. The drawer where I kept the clocks that only told time in synonyms. That seemed like the most logical place in this specific universe. The weight of the heavy bruised sky seemed to settle slightly lower as I turned to descend. The universe was still ticking, even if the springs were made of iron filings and the seconds were replaced by chamomile tea. And it was moving backward, of course. Always backward. I left the tower because the silence that came after the grandfather clock stopped ticking was louder than the ticking itself. It pressed against the walls, thick and oily, smelling like old velvet and disappointment. My fingertips still felt tacky from the golden honey, a stickiness that promised permanence, like an oath I hadn't meant to take. I tried wiping them on the hem of my trousers, but the honey just picked up the threads, incorporating them into its slow, viscous existence. Now my hands felt fuzzy and damp. The exit wasn't a door, but a suggestion, a patch of wall that simply failed to offer resistance. I walked through what felt like a sigh escaping a closed room, and found myself in a corridor that defied straight lines. It was humid, carrying the stagnant, metallic odor of freshly opened tins of peaches left out in the rain. The floor was abrasive under my worn leather shoes. It was not stone or wood, but compacted sawdust mixed heavily with what I immediately recognized as the pulverized shells of peanuts. Every step was accompanied by a dull, grainy crunch, a sound so aggressively ordinary it grated against my fatigued nerves. The air itself was slow. Moving through it felt like wading through lukewarm, thin jelly. The walls were the color of forgotten gravy, rough and cold, made of tightly packed clay mixed with small, sharp fragments of bone. Perhaps chicken bone, or maybe just very brittle porcelain. I ran one hand along the surface, pulling it away immediately because the clay leached the warmth right out of my palm, leaving a residue that smelled faintly of cheap pencil shavings and bureaucratic intent. Down the corridor, maybe 100 yards, the path narrowed violently, choked by a single low wooden table. Behind the table sat a person who seemed constructed entirely from poorly fitted rectangles. He wore a waistcoat woven from actual fishing net and spectacles with lenses the color of weak chamomile tea. He was focused intently on his task, oblivious to the fact that he was preventing all forward motion. The task was, naturally, useless. He was using a pair of tweezers fashioned from polished horn and a small brass funnel to sort grains of sand. He didn't sort them by size or color. He sorted them based on what he termed residual salinity memory. "Goodness," I muttered, the sound immediately swallowed by the dense air. The bureaucrat, for he could be nothing else, given the rigid spine and the complete commitment to futility, didn't look up. His breath came out in short, meticulous puffs, disturbing the minute piles of sand on the table before him. Each grain, once sorted, was placed into a tiny, labeled glass jar. The labels read things like Doubtful Atlantic, Ambiguous Estuary, and Unconfirmed Inland Pool. I stopped maybe 6 feet away, feeling the peanut dust floor shift uncomfortably beneath my soles. The rhythmic sound that permeated the hallway originated from him. A tiny, persistent squeak, the sound of the chair's pivot struggling under the sheer weight of self-importance. "Excuse me," I said, and my voice felt too high, too demanding in this realm of lowered expectations. "I need to proceed." The bureaucrat finished placing a grain, which he identified with a grunt as very minor inland tide pool experience, into a jar marked 44C. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes, magnified monstrously by the tea-colored lenses, were pale gray, like stones that had sat too long in vinegar. "Proceed," he repeated, the word flat, lacking inflection, as though reading it off a faded document. "You wish to proceed." "Yes, I need to go where this hallway eventually spills out. I assume it spills out somewhere." He rested the tweezers carefully next to the brass funnel, adjusting his fishing net waistcoat. "Assumptions are the bedrock of unregistered temporal displacement, sir, and displacement requires certification. Specifically, the Green Intention Waiver Form 30B. The air, already metallic, seemed to take on a sharp paper-cut edge. I felt the familiar pull of total exhaustion. This wasn't movement. This was static friction made flesh. The green intention waiver, I confirmed, trying to keep the weary resignation out of my tone. It was difficult. My voice felt heavy, like wet flannel stuffed into a bottle. What, precisely, does that waive? The waiver does not waive anything, sir. It certifies the intent to move from a position of apathy to a position of mild curiosity, or vice versa. It confirms that the movement you are about to undertake is genuinely necessary, and not merely accidental. He swept his hand over the tiny jars of sand. I am, as you can see, monitoring environmental memory. Movement, even accidental movement, corrupts the baseline. I looked at the jar labeled Unconfirmed Inland Pool. The idea of corruption seemed irrelevant when the environment itself was made of clay and old groundnut shells. I assure you, my intention is extremely simple, I countered, trying to push some movement into my sticky fingers. It is to pass this table and continue walking until I reach a place that doesn't smell like expired canned fruit. Simple intentions are the most difficult to process, the bureaucrat stated, reaching under the table and retrieving a stack of paper thicker than my forearm. The paper was the color of weak mustard and felt like heavily starched canvas. The 30B requires 2 witnesses, proof of backwards chronological experience, and the precise velocity of the transition from one mental state to the next, measured in furlongs per fortnight. Backwards chronological experience. I echoed slowly, the honey on my fingers tightening marginally. I am a clockmaker. I only repair clocks that tick backwards. I literally just left a workshop where I was fixing a clock that was leaking time in the form of golden syrup. He squinted at me through the chamomile lenses, adjusting the position of a jar of sand labeled Suspicion of Coastal Influence. A syrup-leaking clock that ticks in reverse. Interesting. Do you have the certified documentation for the clock's official designation as a registered chronological reversal apparatus? I frowned. The crow who owned it insisted Tuesday was a flavor of sorbet, not a day of the week. Do you think he filled out the designation paperwork? The client's eccentricities are irrelevant to the procedural protocol, sir. If the device was not registered with the Ministry of Preemptive Retrospection, then its function, regardless of its effect, is inadmissible as proof of backwards chronological experience. You might as well claim you turned time back by blinking too quickly. He leaned closer, the smell of dust and dry ink wafting off him. The squeak from his chair intensified, like a small panicked bird trapped in machinery. You see, the green intention waiver is mandatory precisely because you claim to have reversed time. If you reversed time without bureaucratic approval, you are not moving forward in the accepted linear fashion. You are merely unwinding in the current position, which requires the yellow non-committal static permit, Form 99Z. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the humid air settle on my face like a damp towel. Unwinding. Static. The words suited the texture of the day perfectly. So, if I claim I haven't reversed time, I need the green waiver. If I claim I have reversed time, I need the yellow permit, I summarized, opening my eyes to look at the meticulous rows of sand. And both require documentation I do not possess. Precisely. Unless, of course, you wish to register your desire to obtain the 30B or the 99Z, which requires the supplementary filing 14 Omega, the application for application acknowledgement. but that requires the original signature of someone certified as being able to read forms underwater. My feet felt rooted in the peanut dust floor. The exhaustion was so profound it was becoming physical, manifesting as a dull ache behind my knees. I looked at the grains of sand, each infinitesimally different in its imaginary memory of salt. The sheer volume of waste represented by this table was staggering. What happens if I simply step over the table? I asked, the question delivered purely out of morbid curiosity, not actual intent. The bureaucrat didn't even twitch. He picked up his horn tweezers again and gently moved a grain of sand that he decided now harbored lingering doubt of actual oceanic contact. You would disrupt the current calibration of the coastal memory matrix, sir. The consequences would necessitate the immediate dispatch of the Form 77Q enforcement team, who specialize in administering the unsanctioned forward movement penalty. The penalty, naturally, is the mandatory consumption of sand equivalent to your body weight, sorted by their degree of salinity memory. I felt a faint metallic taste at the back of my throat, possibly fear, or perhaps just the continued residue of the metallic air. Sand consumption did not sound appealing, especially the doubtful Atlantic variety. So I cannot move forward, because I lack the waiver proving intent, and I cannot stand still, because I lack the permit acknowledging static presence, I concluded. That is the correct interpretation of the current regulatory environment, the bureaucrat confirmed, his gaze fixed once more on his microscopic task. However, you are permitted to move laterally, provided the lateral movement remains within the predetermined boundaries of this corridor. Lateral movement does not constitute forward progression, nor does it qualify as unwinding, as it is viewed strictly as recreational spatial adjustment under subsection 6, clause 3, and requires no paperwork whatsoever. He then pointed to a thin strip of faded yellow tape running along the clay wall, barely visible amidst the gravy color. Your boundaries are marked by the tape. Feel free to adjust recreationally. I must now return to assessing this grain, which seems to contain echoes of a forgotten jetty. The invitation to pace aimlessly while trapped felt like a deliberate insult. I stood there, sticky-fingered and increasingly desperate for a direction that wasn't lateral. The thought of spending the rest of the day simply shifting my weight from one foot to the other, making slow, grainy crunches on the peanut floor, filled me with a weary dread far deeper than any threat of sand consumption. The squeaking of the chair continued, measuring out the slow, deliberate death of useful time. I watched him carefully place the forgotten jetty sand grain into a jar labeled Highly Suspect Maritime Artifact. I decided to pace laterally, just once, to test the boundaries of my new, small prison. The lateral crunch was identical to the forward crunch. Nothing changes, except the position of the clay wall relative to my shoulder. This felt like victory for the bureaucracy. The angle of the world had changed. I was no longer interested in the shape of the horizon. The horizon was now a ridge of packed, dry soil 3 inches away, an insurmountable cliff face of brown and gray dust. The tower was a vague, distant ache, and the frozen tea windows were simply a memory of sharp corners and diluted bitterness. My boots, which had been perfectly suitable for walking across polished brass floors, were now cumbersome slabs of leather, collecting the sticky grime of the low ground. This wasn't honey stickiness. This was the complex, layered tackiness of things that have failed to rot properly. A mixture of old sap, wet fungal spores, and a fine, oily pollen that smelled like burnt matches and forgotten keys. It clung to the soles with malicious persistence. Every step felt like peeling heavy tape from wet cement. I found myself moving very slowly, having to negotiate obstacles that would have been invisible from a normal height. A small, perfect coil of shed snakeskin, translucent and smelling faintly of cinnamon and old leather, stretched across my path. I had to step over it with the weary precision of crossing a ravine, concerned that disrupting the texture would somehow release a sound I was not prepared to process. The dominant sound was a low, constant hiss, the white noise of friction. It was the sound of dust motes settling onto dry leaves, the sound of root fibers expanding infinitesimally, the sound, I suspected, of my own eyelashes dragging across the air. The light down here was not sunlight. It was a dense, lukewarm amber, filtered through layers of broad, low-hanging foliage belonging to plants I had never bothered to name. They had stems the thickness of my wrist, fuzzy and covered in tiny abrasive hairs that grazed my shoulder every time I passed. The texture of these hairs was dry and irritating, like touching 100 tiny fragments of sandpaper cut specifically to the shape of an asterisk. I pressed my palm flat against the earth for balance. The earth was surprisingly warm, radiating a dull, comforting heat, but it was overlaid with a shallow skin of wet, cold mud, making the sensation confusing, like eating hot soup with a frozen spoon. My fingers sank slightly into the wetness, disturbing a tiny colony of ants carrying a piece of what looked suspiciously like a single dried oat flake, held aloft like a massive, useless bronze shield. My exhaustion was not physical, but textural. Everything demanded attention. I saw a pebble, the size and shape of a human molar, resting perfectly on a small bed of emerald moss. I had to pause, observing the exact way the water condensed on the cool, gray surface of the stone, running down in microscopic rivulets that were immediately swallowed by the spongy green cushion below. The moss itself felt cold and deep, a deceptive surface. If I knelt, pressing my cheek against it, the smell was overwhelmingly of rusted iron and damp sugar, the exact smell of an expensive regret. I watched a droplet of water fall from the tip of a particularly aggressive blade of grass. The fall was glacial. It detached. It wobbled. It gained speed. And when it hit the ground, it exploded with a sharp, high-pitched thwip that sounded like a very small, very unhappy child slapping a wet floor. I had to wait until the echoes of the thwip had completely dissipated before I allowed myself to move again. The waiting felt heavy. There was a peculiar dryness associated with this wet ground. I found a piece of desiccated wood, gray and striated, looking exactly like a piece of salvaged shipwreck. When I picked it up, it crumbled between my fingers into a fine, colorless dust that smelled faintly, distinctly, of old library books and disappointment. This dust mixed with the oily pollen on my hands, creating a gritty paste that was impossible to ignore. I tried wiping my hands on my trousers, but the fabric was already slick with dew and trapped spores, moving the problem, not solving it. I recalled, vaguely, the idea of fixing a clock. The concept seemed absurd now. Clocks measured time. Down here, time was merely the rate at which dust shifted location. I kicked gently at a small mound of soil. It dissolved, revealing a ceramic shard, white with a pale blue pattern. A stylized drawing of a dog attempting to ride a bicycle made of licorice. The surface of the shard was cool, smooth, and provided the only momentary relief for my overstimulated fingertips. It was the only texture that did not actively resist my touch. I moved into an area dominated by ferns, their massive fronds arching over me like the ribbed structure of a forgotten cathedral. The air here was cooler, denser, and carried the specific piercing aroma of crushed green, an odor that felt sharp on the roof of my mouth. I kept my head bowed, tracing the path of a minute river of water, about half an inch wide, carving its route through the packed clay. The water moved with tedious velocity, carrying tiny rafts of foam and what looked like shed insect wings, folded perfectly, like tiny origami boats of chitin. The ground had small embedded crystals, not quartz but something clearer, colder, and utterly tasteless when I touched my tongue to one. A habit I had developed in the tower when checking the temperature of the frozen tea windows. They tasted only of 0 degrees and old silence. A small tremor ran through the ground, not violent, but palpable. I stopped. It was the movement of a large root growing deeper, splitting the soil with slow geological force. The sound it made was like stretched rubber snapping, a dull, drawn-out thok that vibrated up through the soles of my boots and settled heavily in my molars. I stood suspended, unwilling to interrupt the profound labor of the root. This growth, this slow, inevitable expansion of a single organic line, seemed to have more purpose than my entire journey. My leg brushed against a seed pod, dry and spherical, covered in tiny, hooked barbs. It detached from its stem with a barely audible psst and rolled 3 millimeters before stopping against the root. The barbs caught slightly on the weave of my pant leg, a minor irritation, but one that demanded immediate and meticulous removal. I knelt, picking at the barbs one by one, feeling the sharp, dry scratch of the keratin against my already sticky skin. Each tiny prickle felt like a forgotten, necessary insult. I thought about the crow. I wondered if he had ever actually encountered a Tuesday that was edible. Down here, everything was simply a texture. Nothing was a flavor, certainly not a day of the week. Time was just the accumulation of tiny, annoying surfaces. I continued moving forward, always downhill, slightly. The landscape tilted, revealing a large expanse of dark, fine sand, interspersed with shards of glittering mica. This sand was cold, heavy, and moved like liquid when disturbed. It shifted under my weight with a soft, susurrus sigh, the sound of infinite tiny particles greeting their neighbors. It smelled faintly of iron and the exhaustion that comes from having existed for too long. I saw a single thread of spider silk stretching tautly between 2 stalks of wilted rye grass. It was perfectly level, catching the low amber light and casting a faint rainbow sheen. I stopped, watching the minute vibration of the thread in the almost windless air. I knew, with the dull certainty of absolute fatigue, that if I broke that thread, the entire microscopic ecosystem would collapse. And I didn't have the energy to rebuild the thread, or the ecosystem, or even the intent to cross the field of sand without disturbing it. So I waited, allowing the slow, cold progress of the sand to determine my next move, accepting the inertia of the physical world. My fingers were still sticky, now incorporating the cold mica grit, turning the tackiness into something abrasive and strangely metallic. The gold honey had stopped leaking, finally. It didn't stop because I had fixed the mechanism. It stopped because the clock had simply run out of honey and had started weeping a thick, cold syrup of pure, crystalline silence. This silence wasn't the absence of noise, it was a physical substance, dense and suffocating, settling over everything like a blanket woven from tightly packed earwax. The compressed air hammer, which smelled vaguely of stressed juniper berries, simply deflated into a sighing plume of warm fog that tasted exactly like Tuesday. The ice cream, not the day. I looked at the grandfather clock. Its hands were locked at 7:15, and the only thing remaining to do was abandon it, or extract the single component that still seemed slightly relevant to reality. I used the tweezers made from the hummingbird's beak to delicately uncoil the mainspring. It was no longer steel. It was a damp, yellowish length of extremely taut licorice, thick as a rope. It weighed far more than it should, the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts pressing down on my wrist. I tucked the coiled licorice under my arm. It felt slightly tacky against the synthetic fiber of my tunic, making a small, barely perceptible friction sound that immediately seemed rude in the face of the massive, settling silence. Stepping out of the tower felt like pushing through cold butter. The window, made of frozen, unsweetened Lapsang Souchong tea, didn't shatter. It dissolved, leaving behind a brief metallic scent of distant smoke. I stepped out onto the new landscape. The ground was vast, flat, and uniformly textured. It wasn't earth or rock or sand. It was an endless expanse of industrial-grade, moth-eaten, dark purple felt. It absorbed all light and, more importantly, all velocity. Every movement was a decision burdened by extreme, tactile resistance. My shoe, made of stiffened rye bread, sank slightly into the plush, dry fibers of the felt. The friction was monumental, a physical protest against forward momentum. It was the sound of everything slowing down, translated into a landscape. Moving a single meter felt like crossing a swamp while wearing boots filled with concrete dust. I looked up. The crow, still wearing the monocle polished with yesterday's regret, was perched atop a structure that looked suspiciously like a dehydrated giraffe skeleton. He tilted his head, the glass refracting the dull purple light. "You're late," the crow rasped, the sound muffled immediately by the felt, "and you're tracking in the sticky residue of Wednesday's failure." "Wednesday is a color, not a day, Professor," I mumbled, already exhausted by the gravitational pull of the felt. "Precisely, and that color stains everything." He dropped a small spherical object. It landed silently, resisting the bounce. It was a scoop of bright green ice cream. Pistachio. It melted inward, not outward, leaving a small, perfectly dry patch of felt. I realized movement was impossible at this speed. I needed to defeat the friction. I needed to glide. I sat down, which took nearly 20 seconds, the licorice spring digging uncomfortably into my flank. I reached into the satchel I hadn't realized I was carrying, a bag woven from the hair of a tired librarian, and pulled out the necessary materials. First, the fish scales. Not just any scales. These were the discarded scales of the great pouty grouper, a fish that lived exclusively in lakes made of melted anxiety. They were perfectly flat, slightly oval, and possessed a natural internal sheen of oil that resisted adhesion. They smelled faintly of ozone and old pamphlets. The application was tedious. I took the residual honey still coating my fingertips, the warm, golden, viscous substance that hadn't quite set into silence yet, and used it as an adhesive. I had to press 27 scales onto the sole of each rye-bred shoe, overlapping them like slow reptilian armor. Each scale had to face the exact direction of travel, minimizing the vertical grip while maximizing the horizontal slide potential. The process took hours, measured not by the clock, but by the subtle shift in the saturation of the purple felt as the sun continued its slow retreat into the west, where it presumably went to file its retirement papers. My fingers, already sticky, now had the additional complication of the fish oil, resulting in a complex mixture that felt like trying to manipulate wet silk while wearing heavy gloves. The sound of the scales clicking onto the shoe was microscopic, a faint, swift thick, immediately swallowed by the surrounding felt. It was a lonely, repetitive sound that made me consider the profound futility of iteration. When the shoes were finally coated, I stood up. The vertical resistance was still there, the felt refusing to let go, but the horizontal friction was dramatically reduced. I shifted my weight, and instead of sinking and stopping, I achieved a tiny, glorious, uncontrolled slide. But sliding meant I couldn't steer. The felt was too uneven in its refusal to transmit sound and momentum. I needed a mechanism to clear a path, something that would temporarily smooth the fibers ahead of me. I retrieved the shears. These were shears crafted entirely from compressed, highly polished glacial ice, formed in the shadow of a mountain that only existed on Tuesdays. They had razor-sharp edges and an inherent problem. They were perpetually melting. The theory was simple. The melted ice would provide a momentary, slick film over the felt, allowing the fish scales to glide without resistance, creating a smooth, forward path. The practice was agonizing. Holding the ice shears was intensely cold, a shocking contrast to the dry, exhausted air. I had to hold them at an angle of exactly 4.2 degrees to the horizontal plane to ensure the meltwater dripped directly ahead, not onto my rye shoes, which would destroy the honey adhesive. I started walking. The walk was now a strange, stuttering dance. Step 1. Point the ice shears forward. Feel the deep, stinging ache of the glacial cold radiating up my arm. Step 2. Wait for the precise amount of meltwater to form a bead at the tip, enough to coat the felt, not enough to spill wastefully. The bead formation took 8.7 seconds every time. Step 3. Slide the shears forward, letting the water create a narrow, shimmering trail of temporary slickness on the purple felt. Step 4. Execute the forward motion with the scaled shoe, using the initial momentum before the felt could reabsorb the moisture. The slide was glorious, a fast, efficient shh. But it only lasted exactly 1.5 meters before the felt reclaimed the liquid. Step 5. Stop, wait. Repeat the meticulous process of ice drip and glide. The crow watched, occasionally coughing up small, dry pellets of forgotten measurements. Inefficient, the crow chirped, the word tasting of mint and disapproval. Why not simply fly? Flying involves physics, I explained, breathing out a small cloud of condensation that immediately evaporated. And physics requires momentum. The felt resists momentum. We are currently operating in a field of aggressive, negative inertia. I took another painstaking step. Drip, glide, stop. The licorice spring under my arm started to warm up from the friction of my tunic, emitting a faint, sweet smell that warred with the metallic scent of the fish scales and the sterile cold of the melting shears. This odor trail was the only indication of my progress. The air itself seemed thick and resistant, like wading through heavily starched linens. I realized I wasn't just moving. I was systematically dismantling the localized silence, one slow, slippery strip at a time. The physical manifestation of the clock's failure was vast, and my solution was one of agonizing slowness and hyper-specific material science. I might reach the horizon, where the purple felt met a sky that was the color of damp parchment, in maybe 3 weeks, provided the glacial shears didn't melt entirely, or I didn't slip on my own temporary wet trail and get permanently adhered to the resistant felt by the remaining honey. I concentrated fiercely on maintaining the angle of the shears. The cold was moving past pain and into a dull, generalized numbness that was oddly soothing. The cold meant precision. The meltwater meant progress. The exhaustion meant everything was exactly as it should be. Another drip. Another reluctant, sweet-smelling glide across the vast, oppressive texture of non-movement. The honey is getting thicker. It isn't flowing down the escapement wheel anymore. It's adhering, stretching like golden, wet glass between the teeth. The sound of my grandmother's maiden name being whispered by the gears, is getting louder, slightly sticky itself, catching on the soft velvet air of the tower room. I should probably adjust the compressed air hammer, or maybe just lean my head back against the frozen tea window pane and stop pretending that time needs to be managed at all. It manages itself, usually poorly, with no sense of direction or timing. My fingers are so saturated with the specific, sweet weight of this honey, which the crow insists is post-industrial nectar, and therefore worth twice its weight in discarded vowels, that they've lost all sense of texture. Everything feels both immensely heavy and utterly dissolved. It reminds me, annoyingly, of the 3 weeks I spent cataloging dust in the subterranean archives beneath the old city's unlit municipal park. That was a different kind of exhaustion entirely. It wasn't the high, bright fatigue of mechanical failure, or the anxiety of a customer insisting Tuesday is a frozen flavor. It was the low, grinding, sedimentary exhaustion of absolute silence and meticulous, pointless categorization. The archive itself was carved directly out of dry, chalky bedrock, 300 feet down. The air down there was always 42 degrees Fahrenheit, smelling faintly of old parchment and the metallic tang of pressed copper ferns. The light source was not light exactly, but ambient luminescence collected from bioluminescent moss scraped from the roots of deep-sea sponges, stored in jars and diffused through sheets of polished whalebone. It cast everything in a soft, sickly ochre glow that made all edges blur but refused to warm anything. My job was dust management, level 4. This did not involve cleaning. It involved classifying the historical dust that naturally settled on the archived materials. We had charts. The head archivist, a man named Pilcher, who communicated solely through the movement of his eyebrows, which were impressively bushy and often seemed to be arguing with each other, handed me a cedar box containing 6 tiny silk brushes, each labeled with a specific historical epoch. I was assigned Section 7, the era of unnecessary maps. My workstation was a slab of cold, petrified walnut. The main equipment was a microscope with a lens ground from a single teardrop shed by a statue of a sad saint, and a series of 150 glass vials, each pre-labeled with a category of particulate matter. I had to differentiate between standard urban detritus, pre-rainfall vintage, lint from the overcoat of minor clerks, fragments of forgotten intentions, and the highly valuable erosion from the feet of travelers who never arrived. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't empty silence. It was actively full of quiet expectation. The only sound, besides the near-silent shh of the silk brush on ancient bindings, was the constant, polite, rapid-fire chewing of the archive's true staff, the highly educated earwigs. Pilcher, through a series of complex eyebrow movements, had explained that the earwigs were the only creatures capable of digesting and preserving the truly abstract concepts that sometimes leaked out of the older scrolls. They were intensely academic, wore tiny spectacles made of mica, and insisted on using Latin nomenclature for their preferred paper fibers. They lived under my walnut desk, and sometimes during the 4 o'clock sorting session, when the moss light was at its weakest and my eyes felt like they were filled with fine gravel, they would emerge. They were the size of small spoons and looked immensely judgmental. One afternoon, I was trying to distinguish between dust from a specific kind of mauve, expired idea, and dust from a specific kind of ochre, unnecessary map. Both were equally fine, possessing the identical gritty texture of long-forgotten ambition. I used the brush labeled Late Period Disappointment. I collected a small pile, maybe the size of a mustard seed, onto a slide made of polished obsidian. Under the sad saint's teardrop lens, I saw that 3/4 of the particles were clearly mineral fragments, suggesting the dust had traveled. The remaining quarter was organic, slightly helical in shape, indicating it was probably a fragment of a forgotten preposition. I was just about to file it under semi-wandering grammar when one of the earwigs, Professor Glottis 5, crawled onto the desk. He tapped his mica spectacles against the obsidian slide with a sound like 2 grains of sand arguing. He didn't speak. He just made a series of rapid, high-pitched clicks, which, due to the archive's sensitive acoustic properties, resonated in my eardrum with the clarity of a lecture on comparative linguistics. The message, translated by my own exhausted brain, was, "You absolute amateur. That helical structure is clearly cellulose derived from an unused draft of a third-person plural pronoun. Note the distinct lack of sulfur residue, suggesting the idea never encountered even minor friction. That is, undigested possessive abstract, not semi-wandering grammar. Try to keep up. We have budgets to meet." I spent the next 2 hours meticulously separating the dust particles based on potential sulfur content, which was measurable only by placing the dust in a small copper receptacle and waiting 5 minutes to see if the metal tarnished microscopically. It never did. The copper stayed bright, mocking my efforts. The feel of the dust itself was what broke me down. It was dry, cold, and utterly resistant to being manipulated. It felt like trying to pick up silence with tongs. Each particle was a tiny, desiccated memory, and holding too many of them gave me a sense of profound, borrowed futility. I ended up classifying 12 grams of dust over 3 weeks, 12 grams of nothing, precisely divided and labeled. When I finally left, climbing the 300 chalky steps back to the surface, the outside world was overwhelming. The mundane noise of a distant garbage wagon sounded like a volcanic eruption. The smell of slightly damp, living dirt was intoxicatingly rich after the sterile coldness of the archive. I remember standing on the sidewalk, feeling the vague, shifting warmth of the sun on my eyelids, and noticing that my fingernails were lined with an incredibly fine gray powder. I had carried the dust with me, and for weeks afterward, whenever I brushed my hair, a small cold cloud of lint from the overcoat of minor clerks would drift into the air, reminding me that even the most useless tasks leave material residue. Now, here, the honey is the exact opposite of that dust. It is wet, warm, and aggressively present. It sticks. It clings. Where the dust was the essence of absence, the honey is the essence of overwhelming golden substance. I try to shake the memory off, but my hands are currently fixed to the clock face by the viscous sugar. The monocle crow, perched on the pendulum housing, coughs delicately. The sound is dry and irritating, like two pieces of onion skin rubbing together. "You've stopped winding the minute spring again, haven't you?" the crow observes, tilting his tiny head so the light catches the monocle. It is exactly the same shape as the microscopic lens I used in the archive. "Yes," I admit, pulling the hummingbird beak tweezers away from a gear that is now whispering, "Eucalyptus, eucalyptus, eucalyptus." I was wondering what would happen if I just let the inertia stop. "The inertia of what, precisely?" the crow asks, hopping down to inspect my sticky thumbprint on the tower wall. "The inertia of time, or the inertia of tedious obligation, because one of those is theoretical and the other requires premium post-industrial nectar. Don't confuse your metaphysics with my invoice." I sigh, a long, sticky sound that drags on the air. I pick up the hammer of compressed air. It is weightless, cool, and provides no resistance, which feels like a terrible metaphor for everything. I bring it down softly on the main axle, trying to dislodge a particularly stubborn glob of honey that is crystallizing into the shape of a miniature, angry duck. It makes a sound like a quiet pop, followed by the distant, muffled crunch, crunch, crunch of earwigs, chewing on philosophical concepts. The sounds blend. I have to finish winding this clock. The sun rises in the west soon, and that means the crow will demand his payment in the form of 60 seconds of pure, unadulterated flavor, known only as Tuesday. And I still haven't figured out how to distill an entire day into something edible. My focus drifts again. I need another memory to dilute the sweetness of this mess. Something involving water, perhaps, or the texture of poorly preserved soap. Anything to stop the whispering gears. My fingers ache from the phantom cold of the chalky archive dust. The tower is too warm, too sweet. The time is moving backwards, and I am standing still. The honey was relentless. It wasn't just leaking now. It was actively flowing. A thick, slow current pouring from the escapement wheel of the grandfather clock and pooling on the frozen tea floor. My fingers were so saturated with the golden, sickly sweet goo that the tiny hummingbird beak tweezers had become useless, merely sticking to the gears instead of turning them. The sound the mechanism made, the gears whispering my grandmother's maiden name, had become too loud, too insistent, demanding an emotional response I no longer possessed the capacity for. Exhaustion was a physical texture, like wearing a damp woolen blanket woven from bad decisions. I simply stopped. I laid the compressed air hammer down on a bed of crystallized sugar that had formed near the clock's brass pendulum. It was simply too much effort to care if the clock ever told time again, or if the monocled crow ever successfully convinced the world that Tuesday was a legitimate flavor profile. Metallic and slightly burnt, he insisted. "Inadequate, as always," croaked the crow, polishing his monocle with a small gray feather plucked from a particularly cynical pigeon. He perched on the minute hand, which was currently dipping into the honey pool, ticking softly backwards toward the moment before I had agreed to this entire venture. "The time is flowing the wrong way," I stated flatly, the fatigue making my voice sound like gravel being sifted through wet silk. "And it's sticking to everything." "That is the point of time," the crow replied, flapping his wings once, scattering tiny flakes of dried saffron dust. "It should be sticky, otherwise you would simply forget it immediately. Now the philosopher awaits. I require the final analysis of the spoon before the lunar cycle shifts to the flavor of cold butter." I didn't argue. Arguing required muscle tension, and my muscles had officially retired 3 hours ago. I stood up, the sucking sound of my boots leaving the honeyed floor echoing dully in the tower. The windows, made of solidified frozen tea, vibrated with the movement. One shattered near the edge, not with a crash, but with a dry, high-pitched ping that sounded exactly like the word disappointment, spoken in a language understood only by ancient librarians. Leaving the tower was a process of slow descent. The external ladder was made of loosely stacked blocks of stale rye bread, crumbly and dry against my sticky hands. The air outside was shockingly clear after the density of the honey-filled room, smelling distinctly of raw iron filings and the forgotten odor of recently used matches. The sun had not yet risen in the west, but a dull bronze light was beginning to seep up from the horizon, thick and unenthusiastic. The crow flew ahead, navigating by pointing his beak in the direction of things that had already been moved. "We go now to the archive of redundant textures," he squawked, circling a small pile of damp, discarded shoe leather. He is waiting near the section dedicated to the friction of unvarnished oak versus the lament of the common house cat. The ground here was composed of shifting layers of dried plaster dust, making every step a soft, exhausting squelch. Eventually, we arrived at a structure that seemed to be built entirely of enormous, weathered corkboard sheets, held together not by nails, but by the pressure of mutual apathy. The air around the building hummed with a low, perpetual noise, the sound of millions of microscopic things settling forever into place. I pushed open a door that felt surprisingly heavy. It was weighted down by layers of compressed felt, and stepped into the archive. The light source was immediate and strange. Massive, cylindrical vats of lukewarm, pale yellow milk were suspended near the ceiling, glowing softly. The diffused, heavy illumination made everything seem slightly damp and completely without contrast. The smell was overwhelmingly one of dry dust, old paperwork, and the faint, sweet decay of milk that was never quite hot enough. In the center of the largest room, sitting on a low stool fashioned from tightly woven horsehair, was the philosopher. He was a man of remarkable stillness, dressed in a jacket woven from what looked exactly like dry gray moss. He did not look up immediately. He was focused intensely on an object held lightly in his hand. "Tallow," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, choked by the dust of the air. He raised his head slowly. His eyes were the color of weak tea, utterly vacant but meticulously focused. "You are late," Tallow observed, his voice smooth, even, and profoundly bored. The window for optimal observational entropy closed precisely 22 minutes ago. Still, we must proceed. The spoon demands it. He held up the object. It was, incontrovertibly, a common wooden spoon. It was unremarkable. Light-colored beech or maple, well used, the edge slightly worn down by countless bowls of soup. "This," Tallow began, turning the spoon slowly so the weak milk light caught the grain, "is not a utensil for consumption. That is a vulgar reading, a superficial classification used only by those who believe that purpose dictates essence." I shifted my weight, trying to wipe the sticky residue from my fingers onto the cork wall, which absorbed the honey instantly, leaving a small, darker patch. "Look closely at the surface," Tallow instructed, pointing a long, thin finger at the spoon's bowl. "See the microscopic striations? The flaws introduced by the original cutting tool? Do you feel them?" I didn't move. The smell of the lukewarm milk light was starting to make me nauseous. "These are not flaws," he continued. his tone becoming hypnotically monotonous, a low, constant drone perfectly suited to the dull light. These are the imprints of tiny, necessary silences. The spoon is a containment vessel for absence. It holds the sound of the word you meant to say, but did not. It holds the shadow of the afternoon nap you failed to achieve. He turned the spoon over, exposing the handle. This handle, worn smooth by the oil of human palms, is not smooth because of friction. It is smooth because it has rubbed against so many layers of minor historical disappointment. Each micro-abrasion represents a moment where a simple expectation, a hot meal, a moment of peace, a quiet evening, was subtly, quietly eroded. It is, therefore, a portable catalogue of failure, beautifully contained within the geometry of utility. The crow landed on Tallow's shoulder, nodding sagely. "The tactile resignation is key," he muttered. Tallow ignored the crow, now tracing the grain near the handle's tip. Notice how the light sinks into the wood, refusing to reflect sharply. The wood is tired of reflecting. It has seen enough. It has absorbed so much passive, low-grade human weariness that it can no longer generate a vibrant shine. It is absorbing the light, transforming it into a warmer, sadder shade of beige. This spoon, friend, is the physical embodiment of a drawn-out, exhaustive sigh, captured in polished timber. He handed the spoon to me. It felt warm, dry, and surprisingly light, lighter than it should have been, perhaps because it was now filled not with mass, but with the weight of unfulfilled intentions. The texture of the wood grain was unexpectedly fine, catching my sticky skin slightly. The contrast between the dry, resigned wood and the sweet, active stickiness of the honey on my hand was jarring. "The assignment," Tallow said, leaning slightly forward, the moss jacket rustling like drying leaves, "is to determine whether the spoon's capacity for holding disappointment exceeds its capacity for holding liquid. One is measurable in milliliters. The other is measured in the flavor of regret. The crow requires this calibration before he sets the menu for next Tuesday." I stared at the spoon, feeling the subtle, quiet pressure of every unsaid word and failed nap that Tallow claimed was embedded in the wood. It was entirely possible. The air in the archive was so heavy with resignation that any object could become a philosophical monument to futility. I rubbed the bowl of the spoon, feeling the ghost of historical disappointment settle into the honey residue on my palm. It felt like I had just been given a physical chore, to weigh sadness against soup, and I was already too tired to hold either. I stopped winding the springs. The clicking didn't stop. It just got slower, thicker, like trying to pull molasses through a very small, rusty funnel. I let the handle fall, and it didn't clatter against the brass casing. It settled with a soft, syrupy thud. The golden honey spilling from the clock face was now moving with purpose. It had stopped dripping and started flowing, a warm, heavy river that pooled on my workbench, reflecting the dull, tired light coming through the frozen tea windows. The air, which had previously been crisp with the faint scent of old metal and cold chamomile, began to thicken. The compressed air that escaped my hammer, the one made of pure compressed nothing, didn't dissipate. It settled, cold and heavy, around my ankles. It felt like walking through breathable mud, viscous and strangely resilient. Every time I shifted my weight on the stool, I had to physically push the dense air aside, a small, exhausting effort that made my lungs ache with the novelty of localized atmospheric pressure. The monocled crow, perched on a stack of gears that looked suspiciously like fossilized croissants, adjusted its tiny optic. It squawked, a sound that now seemed muffled, absorbed instantly by the humid, syrupy air. "This is unacceptable," the crow rasped, its voice struggling to find purchase in the heavy atmosphere. "The calibration is drifting. If the light continues to filter through that specific shade of thawing Earl Grey, Tuesday begins to lose its proper citrusy profile. It's leaning dangerously toward the woody undertones of a Thursday, a flavor I explicitly rejected during the quarterly review of temporal desserts." I didn't look up. My fingers, sticky with the golden runoff, were trying to manipulate a minuscule piece of escapement mechanism with the hummingbird beak tweezers. The honey had coated the beak, making it inefficient. I felt the slow, steady warming of the room. The windows of frozen tea were finally giving way. They weren't melting into liquid water, but vaporizing into a thick, aromatic steam that smelled of old tannins and resignation. This steam, heavy and warm, saturated the tower, coating everything in a faint, sticky moisture. The color of the room shifted dramatically. We were no longer in pale amber. The condensation refracted the weary light into a suffocating sepia tone. The brass of the clock casing looked ancient now, corroded not by time, but by flavor. Even the shiny new components I'd tried to install looked immediately fatigued, as if they had witnessed the entire history of backward-ticking clocks in the span of 30 seconds. The sound of the gears whispering my grandmother's maiden name, Euphemia Pomegranate, was becoming submerged. The honey was rising inside the clock, drowning the mechanism. The sound wasn't gone. It was just intensely muted, sounding like a confession shared underwater. I realized the gravity wasn't pulling things down so much as it was pulling things together. The sticky air, the dense honey, the humid steam. Everything was consolidating into a singular, exhausting mass. It was getting harder to lift my arm. Not because my muscles were weak, but because I had to peel my skin away from the surrounding atmosphere with every movement. I sighed, a long, drawn-out expulsion of effort that sounded like ripping old wallpaper. The compressed air hammer lay on the bench, inert. It was useless now. If I used it, the burst of compressed air would just add more weight to the floor, possibly trapping my feet entirely. The integrity of the clock must be maintained, the crow insisted, hopping irritably, its monocle catching a sliver of the thick, brown light. I refuse to pay for a clock that measures time in the wrong kind of fruit. "It measures time in honey," I muttered, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand, smearing the gold stickiness across my forehead. The honey felt oddly comforting, like a heavy blanket woven from slow motion. I picked up a tiny vial of oil, intending to lubricate the minute hand, which was spinning counterclockwise at a speed that suggested panic, not precision. The oil, however, wasn't oil. It was chilled, congealed butter. I hadn't noticed the substitution. Everything in this room changed properties when you weren't looking directly at it. I tried to apply the butter with the beak tweezers. It gummed up the already heavy gears instantly. The clock made a sound like an old man trying to chew taffy, and the flow of honey temporarily stuttered before surging forth again, stronger and warmer. The effort of trying to fix something that fundamentally rejected forward motion in an environment that was actively becoming denser and stickier was reaching a critical mass of futility. I watched a glob of golden honey slide off the clock face and sink slowly into the heavy air near my lap, its descent taking an obscene amount of time. a physical manifestation of my own apathy. I closed my eyes, letting the warm, humid air press down on my shoulders. I wondered if I could just solidify here, becoming a permanent, sepia-toned fixture of sticky resignation. If I stopped moving, would the world finally stop demanding that I count backwards? I just needed to hold still long enough for the honey to set. The grandfather clock finally stopped leaking honey when the entire mechanism seized up, freezing the gold liquid into a solid, sticky fossil. It didn't mark the passage of time anymore, but it did anchor the whole tower to the earth with unnecessary gravitational weight. I left the hummingbird tweezers embedded in the main spring, deciding that if the crow wanted his Tuesday ice cream clock fixed, he could retrieve the surgical implements himself. Stepping out was like exchanging one flavor of exhaustion for another. The ground wasn't the hard, crystalline crunch of the tea ice windows. It was a vast, shallow salt marsh that smelled like the inside of an old brass trumpet, slightly metallic and damp. Every footstep produced a sucking sound, low and mournful, like someone tearing wet velvet very slowly. My fingers still felt tacky, coated in the ghost of golden honey, which now attracted fine, silver grains of evaporated salt, giving my hands the texture of cheap, neglected sandpaper. I walked until the tower was just a thin, sticky obelisk against the horizon, its backwards ticking finally muffled by the thick air. The sky here was a pale, washed-out purple, the kind of color you get when you leave berry juice out in the rain for too long. The temperature was precisely neutral, not warm enough to comfort, not cold enough to shock, just a tedious, lukewarm presence that pressed against the back of my neck. It was in this expanse of flat, tired landscape that I found him. The measurer. He was kneeling meticulously at the edge of the marsh, surrounded by an impressive array of highly polished, profoundly useless instruments. He wore heavy gloves woven from compressed wheat straw, and every time he flexed his fingers, a faint, dry scratching noise emanated, like mice whispering inside a dry loaf of bread. His focus was absolute, centered on a small, insignificant clump of reeds casting a shadow barely larger than a dinner plate. He had a massive brass caliper, larger than a suitcase, which he used not to measure distance, but to delicately pinch the edge of the shadow itself. He held this with the detached reverence usually reserved for expensive mistakes. "It's the thermal drift," he stated without looking up, his voice a low, steady drone that cut through the silence like a poorly maintained saw. The differential radiation coefficient of an absence of photons. Standard measurement is 0.0003 degrees Kelvin cooler than the adjacent lit surface. But that's for still shadows. This, here, he tapped the slate tablet where he was logging his results, is a moving shadow. I stood there, the salt clinging to my honey-sticky skin, watching the pathetic, slow creep of the reed's shadow as the washed-out light moved marginally across the sky. "And what does a moving shadow measure?" I asked, the question tasting thick and pointless in my mouth. He sighed, a long, careful expulsion of air that sounded surprisingly heavy, like dropping a sack of damp feathers. "It measures the quality of regret inherent in the light that missed it. It measures how much colder the shadow gets when it realizes it has to change shape to accommodate the world's carelessness." He adjusted a small, intricate thermometer held near the ground. It wasn't filled with mercury, but with a shimmering, viscous liquid that seemed to catch and distort the purple light, like liquefied nostalgia. "I'm documenting the exact moment the shadow decides it's not worth the effort," he continued, his eyes squinted with obsessive concentration. "See that flicker? That subtle drop? That's 0 neuron Kelvin of existential dread. It's hard to log it accurately without equipment made from refined apathy. I looked at the thermometer of nostalgia. The liquid was receding slightly, sinking toward the lowest calibration mark, which was labeled "The Taste of Wednesday Morning." The reeds casting the shadow were unremarkable, smelling faintly of old fish scales and damp earth. Yet, this man was meticulously quantifying the emotional temperature of their darkness. My own exhaustion felt sudden and absolute, like a weight made of damp towels dropped onto my shoulders. Fixing clocks that ran backwards was at least a tangible, if perverse, task. Measuring the remorse of a shadow seemed like an infinite regression of fatigue. I considered telling him about the golden honey clock, perhaps offering him a sample of the dried sweetness, which now felt like hardened misfortune on my palm. But that would require movement, and the ground here made movement sound too much like tearing something fragile. "Do you ever finish?" I managed, the salt rasping slightly in my throat. He paused, the brass caliper hovering precisely above the shadow's edge. "Finish?" "No. The light keeps moving, doesn't it? The light never stops being rude enough to keep changing its mind. The shadow is always recalculating its disappointment. I just log the data until the ambient temperature of the surrounding air renders the whole endeavor irrelevant. That usually happens around 4 p.m., when the air itself gets bored." He marked a microscopic reading on his slate. The graphite pencil made a tiny, high-pitched scratching sound, like a mosquito landing on glass. The new entry read 1403 p.m. Shadow integrity declining. Observation. The shadow seems to be favoring the east edge of the reed clump, possibly indicating an anticipation of the next hour's inevitability. I realized I hadn't moved in 5 minutes. The salt grains on my hand were melting slightly, reacting to some residual warmth, or perhaps just the sheer proximity of pointless endeavor. I needed to leave before I was assigned the task of measuring the acoustic density of his whispered observations. I turned and continued across the marsh, the sucking sound of my departure irritatingly loud, carrying with it the silent, precise coldness of the shadow's regret. It was hard not to feel that, in leaving, I had just introduced another variable he would need a new, specialized tool to ignore. The end of the road, or what I suppose passes for it, was visible now, looming out of the flat, gray haze that always smelled vaguely of forgotten birthdays. It wasn't the heroic sort of destination one usually travels toward. No sparkling spires or gates of hammered gold. It was a structure built primarily of sheer, unmotivated geometry, rising in a way that defied the expectation of comfort or sense. I could see the place, a chaotic stack of non-parallel surfaces, like someone had tried to fold a map of the city using only their elbows. It was irritatingly vertical. The structure, I decided to call it the Citadel of Misalignment, mostly because naming things makes them marginally less heavy to look at, was composed not of bricks or steel, but of what looked like pressurized, crystallized silence. When the light hit it, which happened infrequently and always through a heavy filter of dried apricot halves suspended perpetually in the air, the walls shimmered with the color of an old photograph of a spoon. My feet dragged through the paving stones, which here were not stones at all, but thick, cold discs of solidified boredom, paved unevenly with thin, irritating shards of mica. Every step caused the mica to vibrate with a low, tuneless hum, a sound that felt less like noise and more like a physical suggestion that I should be moving faster, a suggestion I firmly chose to ignore. The air itself was dense here, thick and fibrous, feeling exactly like trying to pull on a coat woven entirely from iron filings. It didn't breathe easily. It had to be chewed slightly before it would cooperate with the lungs. The honey was still there. After all these weeks, the residue from the grandfather clock was permanently fused to the pads of my fingers, coating them in a thin, golden stickiness that attracted every speck of dust, every fleck of mica, and every stray whisper of ozone clinging to the air. I tried scraping it off against the rough texture of my knee. My trousers felt like they were woven from old carpet samples, but it only smeared, achieving a duller gloss but remaining stubbornly adhesive. The constant, tacky pull was now less a mechanical issue and more a philosophical one. My entire existence had become predicated on slight resistance. I found a spot near the citadel's base where the architecture decided to take a brief nap, manifesting as a bench made of solid, polished fog. I sank onto it, the cold seeping immediately through the thin soles of my boots. My exhaustion was complete. No longer a feeling, but a heavy apparatus bolted firmly to my spine. I was too tired to even be properly discouraged. Discouragement requires energy to maintain its posture. I simply sat there, observing the windows of the citadel, which were not transparent in the usual sense. They were panes of highly polished, forgotten applause, reflecting the dull sky back in fractured, uncomfortable angles. I thought, fleetingly, about the mechanics of cumulative fatigue. Is it the mainspring of the body that unwinds too fast, or simply a single, crucial gear that decided its rotation was no longer meaningful? Perhaps the clock of my own movement had simply run out of escapement teeth. I reached into my pocket, the movement slow and deliberate, like stirring cold molasses. My tweezers, the delicate ones made from the hummingbird's beak, were still tucked securely beside a small, perfectly dry biscuit I had been carrying for 9 months. I pulled them out, not to fix anything, but just to look at the fragile geometry of tools designed for precision. The citadel smelled primarily of ozone and very insistent, industrial-strength lavender cleaner, which only served to emphasize the sheer absurdity of the structure. Someone, somewhere, was attempting to maintain hygiene in a building designed to violate the laws of physics. Management, I thought dimly. There is always a need for management, even when what you manage is the slow collapse of meaningful travel. I didn't care why I was here, or what I was supposed to do inside the misalignment citadel. The exhaustion had polished away all motivation, leaving behind only the simple, granular sensation of being physically present. The biggest effort left in me was calculating how long I could sit on the fog bench before I merged completely with the cold atmosphere. I traced the pattern of my own sticky fingerprints on the dusty surface of my trousers. They looked like small, meaningless constellations named after different types of minor bureaucratic error. The humming of the mica pavement continued, a repetitive, low-frequency argument with silence. And I considered finally succumbing to the temptation of simply not winding the springs anymore, and seeing if the world would dare to stop moving without me. I highly doubted it would. The world has always been selfishly motivated, continuing its tedious rotation regardless of my mechanical input or lack thereof. It was frustratingly self-sufficient. I just needed 5 minutes without the scent of over-caffeinated cleaning products interfering with my apathy. The hummingbird beak tweezers slipped, embedding themselves lightly in the soft, crystallized crust, forming where the golden honey met the brass casing. I didn't bother pulling them out. The compressed air hammer was already useless, vibrating on the workbench like a nervous beetle. I had stopped winding the mainspring an hour ago, hoping for the cessation of universal movement, but the world was disappointingly robust. It merely continued to smell of scorched dust and the faint metallic tang of old pennies. My fingers were fused together into sticky, amber-colored mittens. I lifted the grandfather clock. It wasn't heavy, but the effort required to peel my palms off the work surface made my shoulders ache with a dull, familiar complaint. The clock continued to weep its thick, slow minutes onto the polished wood floor. Each drop landed with a plush thwop, immediately attracting a swarm of tiny, transparent moths that looked like flying flakes of dandruff. I navigated the narrow corridor leading to the crow's receiving room, scraping the honey-covered clock against the wall. The texture of the stone here was rough, covered in a slow-growing lichen that felt exactly like damp velvet when brushed. The air thickened noticeably as I moved, transitioning from the cool, isolated stillness of my workshop to the humid, over-processed warmth of the client's chamber. The room was dedicated entirely to the classification of crumpled linen. The temperature was high, thick with the scent of industrial-strength bronze polish and repetitive steam, the kind used to flatten the soles of old handkerchiefs. The floor was piled with segmented baskets, and in the center, perched precariously atop a pyramid of neatly folded but deeply wrinkled socks, was the crow. He looked exactly as I remembered, perhaps slightly dustier. The tiny monocle was fixed firmly over his left eye, catching the light that filtered through the high, narrow window, which was itself glazed with something that looked suspiciously like solidified chicken broth. He was using his beak to flick small pieces of lint into a waiting silver funnel. "Clockmaker," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves being pushed across pavement. He didn't look up immediately. He was busy listening intently to the sound produced when a striped sock, likely wool, was gently squeezed. Thump. "The clock is fixed," I stated, placing the leaking instrument carefully on the floor where it could continue its sticky lament. The gears move backwards. The chiming mechanism plays the sound of rainfall inside a dry cave, and it is currently counting down to yesterday's breakfast. The crow finally lifted his head, tilting the monocle to better inspect the stream of gold dripping from the casing. He hopped down, landing softly near the honey puddle. His reflection in the goo was stretched and distorted, making him look less like a dignified client and more like a melted umbrella handle. "The mechanism is satisfactory, I assume," he said, pecking lightly at the honey. "But the flavor, that is the crucial metric, Clockmaker." I sighed, adjusting the collar of my sticky uniform. "The flavor is merely the residue of compressed time, Your Excellency. It tastes of oxidized nostalgia and low-grade beeswax. It's unavoidable." He dipped his entire beak into the viscous flow and pulled it out, dripping slowly. "Unacceptable. You know the requirement. Tuesday. It must taste exactly like Tuesday." The repetitive thump of the sock categorization continued behind us, making the whole conversation feel deeply anticlimactic. The humidity was making my clothes stick to my spine, and I could feel the invisible lint beginning to irritate the soft skin behind my ears. "Tuesday is not a flavor. It is a temporal designation," I recited, having had this argument weekly for the past 3 seasons. The crow looked at me with an expression of profound pity, or perhaps just avian confusion. "That is precisely what they want you to believe, Clockmaker. Tuesday is distinctly vegetal, a slight bitterness offset by the lingering warmth of forgotten ambition. This," he gestured dismissively with a honey-soaked wing, "is clearly a Friday afternoon. Too much resignation, not enough aggressive optimism." I stared at the clock, which was now vibrating slightly, the internal workings sputtering as the gears choked on the thickening sweetener. I wanted desperately to sit down on the nearest clean stack of linen, even if it meant risking the wrath of the lint sorter, currently operating silently in the corner. My exhaustion felt less like fatigue, and more like a physical weight pressing down on my internal organs. I just needed him to accept the clock. I just needed the smell of bronze polish to stop stinging my nostrils. I can adjust the tension on the mainspring to simulate the acoustic decay of a half-forgotten Tuesday morning, I offered, my voice flat. But the inherent sweetness of the temporal leakage is immutable. It's what keeps the past from sliding off the calendar entirely. The crow considered this, wiping his monocle with a tiny, impeccably folded linen napkin that smelled sharply of lavender and regret. Acoustic decay, he mused. Yes, that might suffice, provided it sounds exactly like the specific Tuesday when the milkman wore the wrong hat. I closed my eyes. The battle was over the nuance of a specific Tuesday morning, measured in sound and smell, not the functionality of the mechanism that dictated the flow of time itself. It was exactly as banal and exhausting as I expected. The grandmother's maiden name, whispered by the brass escapement wheel, was the final trespass. It wasn't a loud whisper, more of a dry metallic rustle, like old silk being peeled from hot pavement. But it was insistent. It was too personal for a clock that was supposed to only concern itself with the logistical failure of causality. I lifted the hummingbird tweezers, sticky with the golden syrup, and simply dropped them onto the felt workbench. They made no sound, absorbed instantly by the thick layer of compressed pollen and dust that had accumulated since last winter, or maybe the winter before that. I was past caring about the precision of the calendar. The grandfather clock stood there, majestic and ridiculous, its face smeared with crystallized honey that caught the faint, pale light leaking through the frozen tea windows. The sun had definitely taken early retirement. The sky outside was a uniform, non-committal gray, the color of wet cement mixed with resignation. It didn't feel like the west or the east. It felt like nowhere in particular. My index finger rested on the last coiled spring I was supposed to tension, the one that governed the rate at which memories dissolved. I looked at the shimmering golden residue coating my hand. It was sweet, profoundly so, but the sweetness had a metallic undertone, the faint taste of copper pennies that had been left in a swamp for 100 years. The texture was cloying, pulling slightly at the thin skin between my knuckles. It was warm, too, the honey always unnervingly warm, as if it was actively fermenting seconds into something palatable. If I wound the spring, the whispering would continue, speeding up until it sounded like 1,000 crickets trying to spell a 4-letter word in Morse code. If I left it, the clock would just leak, slowly, pointlessly. I pulled my hand back, deliberately not engaging the spring. I didn't feel a sudden rush of freedom, just the settling weight of fatigue that had been hovering like a particularly dense cloud. The crow, perched silently on the rim of the tower's central supporting beam, adjusted its miniature monocle with one claw. It didn't speak. It just emitted a small, sharp harumph, the sound of tiny, feathered judgment. It seemed to understand that the performance was over. "It will leak," I stated, the sound of my own voice dry and unused. "The golden mess will just keep coming until the case fills up. Then the tower base. Then the world." The crow blinked slowly. I pushed away from the workbench. The decision felt less like an act of defiance and more like the natural endpoint of exhaustion. Why spend energy preventing a slow, golden apocalypse when the sun couldn't even manage to show up for work? I walked over to the nearest window. The pane, made of firmly frozen Darjeeling, released a faint scent of tannins and citrus peel as the ambient air shifted. I scraped a fingernail across the hard, chilled surface. The world outside, viewed through the amber, icy lens, looked blurred and entirely unconvincing. Everything was slightly warped, elongated, and tinted brown. I could see the outline of the inverted mountain range, the one that usually housed the clockwork goats, but today they were still, completely still. I sat down hard on a stack of redundant chime hammers, heavy, square blocks of lead that smelled faintly of mothballs and regret. The cold immediately seeped through the thin fabric of my trousers. The world wasn't stopping. It was just waiting for the honey to catch up. And I was too tired to wind it backwards anymore. I closed my eyes, letting the sticky warmth of the honey residue cool slowly on my palms, listening only to the methodical drip, drip, drip of the leaking time. I stopped trying to fish the mainspring out of the golden syrup that was now steadily oozing from the clock's face. The tweezers, made from that delicate hummingbird beak, were slick and useless. The crow could keep its monocle and its insistence that Tuesday was a flavor of ice cream, but I was done with temporal maintenance. I pressed the hammer, the one made of compressed air, hard against the wall directly behind the 12 o'clock marker. The compressed air didn't fix the clock, but it punched a perfectly circular hole into the brickwork, leading into an immediate, muffling darkness that smelled like wet moss and the charred wax of forgotten birthday candles. I didn't climb out. I simply slid, letting the thick, viscous honey on my hands grease the descent. The back of my coat snagged momentarily on a shard of frozen tea, clinging to the edge of the window frame, producing a tiny, crystalline noise like a distant, extremely polite scream. I landed in softness. It wasn't a cushioned landing. It was a floor made entirely of tightly compacted, ancient cotton candy. It was firm enough to hold my weight, but every adjustment of my shoulder or hip caused a faint, dry psst sound as the sugar fibers resettled. The air here was cool and heavy with the scent of dried church incense mixed with stale rain, the unmistakable, profound aroma of absolute futility. Above me there were no stars, only the shelter of massive, silent forms. They were ferns, but not green. They were enormous, motionless blades of polished copper, cool and slick to the touch, reflecting nothing except the diffused gray light I hadn't noticed until now. I laid flat, allowing the soft, sugary ground to cradle the fatigue. The residue of the golden honey on my palms dried instantly against the sugary fiber, pulling the sticky goo away and leaving a slightly chalky white dust on my skin. I closed my eyes and considered the true nature of the crow's complaint. It wasn't that the clock was slow, it was that the entire mechanism of existence had simply lost interest in keeping time and had handed the maintenance tools to someone too tired to argue. I wouldn't wind the clock tomorrow. I wouldn't wind the sun. I wouldn't even wind the tiny, tight spring of personal obligation that usually kept my diaphragm moving. I would just lie here, beneath the indifferent copper ferns, until the sugar beneath me felt suitable to absorb the entirety of my tedious geometry. The tweezers made from the hummingbird's beak felt impossibly light, yet my hand felt heavy, thick with the golden honey oozing steadily from the hour markers. I had stopped wiping my fingers maybe 3 hours ago, when the crow, perched precariously on the minute hand, assured me that stickiness was merely a complex form of structural integrity. The honey was starting to cool now, pulling taut like fine, sweet wire between my thumb and the compressed air hammer. The grandfather clock, relieved of my useless attention, had reduced its leaking to a steady, rhythmic plop onto the rug, and the sound of the gears whispering my grandmother's maiden name, Cloverdale, Cloverdale, was thinning, stretching out like taffy pulled too thin. It was a tedious, high-pitched plea for deceleration. I looked up at the window pane, where the frozen tea held the last bruised violet light of the west. It smelled faintly of bergamot and impending dormancy. I should have wound the spring, but the key, made of a solidified drop of morning fog, was too cold to grip properly. I let it fall. It landed silently in a pool of drying honey. The crow merely sighed, adjusted its monocle, and declared that the lack of winding was precisely why Tuesday ice cream tasted so much like the color purple this season. My head felt like one of the leaking honey vats. I didn't have the energy to argue about flavor dynamics or calendar days. I leaned against the clock housing, the back of my shirt adhering instantly to the varnish. The whispering stopped. The only sound left was the slow, distant cooling of the air, and the definite, final realization that if I simply closed my eyes, the clock wouldn't tick backward, forward, or even sideways. It would just wait, suspended in thick, amber silence, until I decided to move again. And I was extremely tired.